Hey, how you doing? My name is Chuck Hubanoff, and today we're going to be talking about the different varieties of kitchen knives or chef knives. So when I decided to do this video series on culinary school lessons or lessons from culinary school, it seemed logical to start with the most important tool that you're going to use throughout your entire career. And that is the knife. Whether it be a chef's knife or a slicer or a petty or a paring or whatever it is, knives are so crucial day in and day out in the professional kitchen. It's something that I think every chef has a passion for. It's something that you start to grow accustomed to certain ones. You become quite attached to a few, and it can get very protective if someone starts mistreating one of your favorite knives. And I know that every chef has their favorite knife. So as you can see on this table here, we have a tremendous amount of knives. Let's break this down category by category so that we'll be able to understand the different uses for each shape and each length that we have. Alright, so let's start with cleavers. Cleavers. I have here an assortment of cleavers. I'm kind of missing a traditional Western cleaver, and I'm missing a Chinese cleaver right now. But this is still a good variety. So whenever I think of cleavers, I think of two kinds. I think of a meat cleaver and a vegetable cleaver. So up top, these two up here would be meat cleavers. Meat cleavers they're very heavy. They are more based on weight and brute force than super sharp edges. And they're used mostly for breaking down whole animals and hacking through bones. If I'm trying to separate a rib cage from a pig or something like that, then I'm using a meat cleaver. Cleavers are not something that's in every chef's knife bag or kitchen because they're not that common in terms, like, most people are not doing whole animal butchery. And really that's what they're used for. So it's not that common for every chef to have one. And they're really heavy to carry in your knife bag all the time. One thing that a lot of chefs do have and really prefer is a vegetable cleaver. And when I think of a vegetable cleaver, I think of something that has a very, very thin spine and a very thin edge. Vegetable cleavers are fantastic. Super sharp, super light. They're used, they can bust through the vegetable prep very, very quickly. But that's really what they're good for. They're not good for much else because the edge is so delicate. And even very hard vegetables, butternut squash or things like that, I would never touch with this knife. It would break. But for julienning onions or really softer vegetables, these things are fantastic. In some ways, the vegetable cleaver might act in a way more similar to a chef's knife than it does in the cleaver category. But it does have a cleaver shape, so we're going to keep it in this section. In the middle here, I have something that is not seen very much, and this is sort of a hybrid. It's a coconut knife or a coconut cleaver. So it has a very heavy, thick spine, and the edge actually becomes quite thin, so it's pretty darn sharp for how rustic it is. I love this knife. There was a woman in Vietnam who always sold coconuts that I went to daily, and she hooked me up with this thing, so I had to get it. When we talk about a Western cleaver, it's basically the same as these Asian cleavers up here. It's just a big, heavy knife. Anytime I think about cleavers, I'm always thinking about a chopping motion, not a slicing motion. Their motion is up and down. We're going to get more into knife technique in an upcoming video, but for this episode, I just wanted to kind of go through the different varieties. So let's move on to slicers. Slicers. I love slicers. This is my favorite knife. Absolutely favorite knife. Slicers are long. They tend to be minimum 9-inch, and that would be a short slicer. For me, the longer the slicer, the better. And they are going to be lightweight. They're going to have a thin spine and a thin edge. They tend to be able to get very, very sharp. And when I have a slicer, I'm always thinking of slicing, that back and forward motion. So we have 3 examples of a slicer here. I have 2 Japanese-style slicers here. This would be a double bevel where it's ground the same on both sides versus the single bevel, which is flat on one side and has an extreme edge on the other. And then a Western slicer, which is very similar to the Japanese style. It's just the same double bevel. It's this ground the same on both sides. Okay, next we're going to talk about steels or honing rods. Steels or honing rods can get quite confusing because some people call them sharpening steels or sharpening rods, and really they don't sharpen anything, they straighten the edge. So a steel is something that you should have in your knife bag. It's something that if you are working professionally, you will use on a daily basis. And as you prep throughout the day, the edge on your knife will start to bend a little bit. and when you use the steel, it'll straighten it back out to bring its sharpness back. So I have two varieties of steels here. I have basically a cheapo round guy, and my FD, which is a beast. This steel is incredible. You don't really think there's much to a steel, but when you use a good steel, you realize, like, holy crap, these things are awesome. So we'll get more into these in a sharpening video coming up. In terms of steels, it's just know that they are for straightening the edge, not for sharpening. And we'll get in a future video, we'll get in actually how do we use this thing. Okay, the chef's knife. The go-to, if you're only gonna have one knife, you should have a chef's knife. It's the thing that can do all the things. You can slice with it, you can chop with it, you can dice with it, you can do everything with a chef's knife. It's not the best at every single task, but it can do every task. That's why it's so effective and so common, I guess. We have a variety of chef's knives here. Most chef's knives would typically be in the 8-inch to 10-inch range. There are some 12 inches as well. Typically for me, I prefer a bigger knife. Basically in every situation, I like the biggest knife I can get. I find it more useful. But so we have two typical 8-inch knives, very popular, Wusthof and a Victorinox. And then we go into like a 9-inch carbon steel knife with a Mizuno, and I have a 10-inch Wusthof as well. One of the reasons the chef's knife is so popular, besides for the fact that you can slice with it and you can chop with it, because of its rounded shape, a lot of people do this roll cut type of action, which, although is not the highest technique or the best technique possible, it can be a very quick and effective cut. So we'll get into that in a further video on knife technique, but for now, let's move on to serrated. Alright, so serrated knives. Basically, serrated knives we're going to use to cut very, very soft objects, things that would crush under a blade. Although, if your straight knife is sharp enough, you can cut anything. You don't need to serrate it. Typically, for a serrated knife, I'm basically either cutting chocolate or bread. You know, depending on if you don't have any super sharp knives available, I would use this for tomatoes as well, because it cuts through tomatoes very well. And it cuts through chocolate amazing. If you're not cutting chocolate if you're cutting chocolate with a straight edge, it's difficult. With a serrated edge, it's super easy. We're going to go into the technique of using a serrated, because there is definitely a strategy or a method on how to cut straight, because that's not easy. And once you start making your cut on bread, if you don't cut it straight, it doesn't look good. Basically, these here are all the same. There's not much difference to these. Okay, boning knives. Typically, boning knives are used in butchery, you know, to take meat off the bone or for breaking down a whole animal. They come in a lot of different shapes and a lot of different sizes. Every country almost has a different style of knife for how they like to debone or how they do their butchery. Up top, we have basically a Western boning knife, which has that slight curve and the bend. Some boning knives will have a little bit of flex. This is a stiff boning knife. Then we move on to a Japanese hanging butchery knife. This is a poultry boning knife, and then I also have a fillet knife, which I'm going to kind of keep in the same category, though it's a little bit different, but you know, this would be used for fish, and you can, with the fillet knife, you can get that extreme flex that it gets. Super bendable. Whoop, there it is, super bendable. So petty knives are kind of like this mini chef's knife, or this mini slicer. You know, this one has more of the chef's knife shape, this mini chef's knife. This one has more of a mini slicer shape. I don't really like petties. I don't find them that useful, because for me, I'm either going to be using if it's a small task, I'm going to be using a paring knife. If it's a large task, I'm going to be using a chef's knife. So having these, I don't particularly use them very much. The one thing would be if you're in a very tight situation, like on a line and there's a lot of cooks around you, it might be nice to have a smaller knife. There's less risk of stabbing anybody. So this particular type of petty has a little bit of flex to it, so I actually do really like this as a boning knife or a fillet knife, because of that flex and because of how thin the actual face is. Where a petty like this that has that chef's knife shape, that has no flex to it, really, I don't use this at all. I have no use for this. But if you're just starting your knife journey or your skills are not that strong, you may find it easier to start with a small petty knife as opposed to a 8-inch chef's knife, just when you're learning the basic technique. But after that, I think you'll quickly graduate to a full-blown chef's knife, and then for your small task, going back to a paring. So, speaking of paring knives are little tiny guys. very small blades, usually about 3-inch blade or smaller. You can see quite a variety of shapes and sizes, from again this sort of tiny chef's knife shape to a much angular, something that would be in the hand, to this curved bird's beak type shape that looks like a talon, and then we have some serrated varieties as well. Paring knives are used for small tasks. Some people prefer to use that for, like, if they're just mincing a clove of garlic. For me, I'm always going to use a big chef's knife for that, or a slicer. Where paring knives really excel is in the hand work. When I pick up the food item and I have it up here and I'm working with it in front of me. And whether that's peeling mushrooms or cleaning garlic, or there's a variety of tasks that happen in hand. And that's where paring knives really are suited, where they do their best. And in that situation, when we're in the hand moment, I always prefer these bird beaks, these ones that have the curve. I just like the being able to kind of dig in and have that accurate point to come into. So for me, I really very rarely would use any sort of this little chef's knife shaped paring knife. Even this straight edge paring, I find myself very rarely using that. Most of the time I just keep a bird's beak paring knife with me. And even though this one may look cooler and it is more money, I like these little cheapo guys. I like how thin it is in my hand, and sometimes these bird beaks can be pretty hard to sharpen because of that shape. So, I don't mind after 6 months of use if I toss this and get another one. And then a little serrated paring knife is good to have too. It can be quite useful on the line if you're cutting bread, or you find uses for these things. So those are the categories of knives. In future videos, we're going to demo each knife and how it's used. We're going to go over basic knife cuts and basic safety and knife techniques. So if that's something you're into, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because we're really going to go super in depth on all of it. If you like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments, or like to know where I get my knives or which one I would suggest in each category, let me know. I'd love to answer it. And I'll see you guys next time. All right.